Okay, hi everybody. We're going to continue studying India in this class. We're focusing on economic development, which is something we've covered in every country because it's so vitally important in terms of people developing themselves as individuals, right? Human Development Index and moving up Maslow's hierarchy. Um, India's economy has all the potential to grow as fast as China's has over the last 40 years. And in some ways, if they make different choices and make different adjustments, they could leapfrog China because for reasons we'll go over in this section. And so that's one of the most interesting, compelling things in terms of studying India, is that it does have some unique advantages in the fact that many of its citizens speak English, and that gives it access to larger parts of the world economy. But India also has aspects of its culture and history and society that are different than China, like on religion and caste and women, that potentially hold it back. And that's what makes comparative analysis so interesting. And you can see on the GDP per capita, India is behind China, and its life expectancy is behind China. And this is, what is that, roughly 10 years of life expectancy and maybe a generation of economic development. And India's, again, its GDP per capita is smaller, and its infant mortality rate is higher. And it's interesting when you study India that, and this is a very, very broad generalization, but that like the United States has a northern region culture, New England, and a southern culture and region that has certain attributes and histories. India, in a very broad way, has a north which is super fertile, it's densely populated. Women in this area, generally speaking, are not as equal as women are considered in the South. There are intense territorial disputes up here with Pakistan and along China-Nepal region. Bigger families, more religious area up here in the South is in some ways a little more like Southeast Asia economically, more entrepreneurial, more innovative financially. That has also important crop regions, but is riskier with 4 months of monsoon rains, smaller, more middle-class families, less children per family per woman, and less densely populated. And you can see this, these are the areas where you have really high rates of densely populated areas of poor people. And then in the South, you have this little region up here, which is less populated, but less poverty. This has a different, in some ways, a slightly different cultural feel and different economy, different strengths and weaknesses in its economy. And this is I think we keep coming back in this class. So what is really important? What is the thing that we keep coming back to? And it's human development. It goes back to Maslow's hierarchy. We want to secure the bottom rungs of safety and food and necessities, and we want to move up to love and to art, to morality, to ethics, to the greatest potential that we have as human beings. And the areas that are able to do that more are places where there's more peaceful coexistence and there's more economic development, and all people, regardless of whatever caste, religion, gender, sex they may be, has the chance to get as high on the development ladder as they can possibly get. And one of the biggest obstacles to that is poverty. Always has been, always will be. And when countries reduce poverty, they increase human development. And they increase life expectancy. It's the same pattern. All the places that have the highest development, the longest life expectancy, are the places that also have some of the most economic development. And this is another thing that makes India so fascinating, is that it kept the parliamentary democracy from Britain, the robust free press, the federalism of different states, judicial review, constitutionalism from the US and the British. And then up until the 1990s, so after they got rid of the British in the partition up to the 1990s, they mixed that sort of stuff that we're familiar with, Soviet-style command and control, socialist economy that was closed off to foreign investment, foreign goods, and to world trade. And it's totally legitimate and understandable why they did that. They've been exploited for 200 to 400 years by the British, completely exploited. And they didn't want to just open themselves up to the exploitation of world trade. So they closed it all off. But the downside is they didn't grow very much, right? And by the early 1990s, India was on the verge of economic collapse. And that's when as part of taking a loan bailout from the IMF, they opened up their economy, and India has grown significantly since then. I mean, almost, just exponentially. Now, what describes the Indian economy now? Well, the thing that stands out is that half of the economy and half of the employment in the economy is made up of agriculture, right? And it's even though the services of India makes up 60% of the actual GDP, it's still agriculture that the majority of the population does. Bare majority, it's about 50%. So you have this this is what any economy in any country is trying to eventually evolve out of, is to liberate more of farmers who live very precarious and risky lives, growing crops that are subject to catastrophe by the weather or by whatever the price is for that crop. They're trying to get more people off farms and into the services in the industry and manufacturing that are less risky with bigger profit margins. The United States, 100 plus years ago, 1900, a third of the population in the US were farmers on small plots. And now it's down to 2%, and the 28% of the people that used to be farmers can now be doctors and teachers and other professions. The percentage of the total population living in rural areas often connected to agriculture is the highest in India. Look at China, they've halved that. China's industrialized. Now China's going to higher end, bigger profit industries. And that's how it's getting wealthier. And India wants to do the same thing, as it should. You can see, China's GDP growth rate is sort of stabilized. It's trending down a little bit, as all wealthier countries do over time. You can't grow at the initial level. Look at India, just so much volatility in its economic growth. And maybe this volatility is the function of the things that we're covering on the role of religious conflict, tribalism, and caste, and women's role in society. India has improved in its rankings of places to do business, right? These are the places we've covered. There's the traditional top ones. There's the United States at 8. There's Japan, we covered first, 39th. Then we moved on to China. Then we did Vietnam. Now we're doing India. And then we'll cover South Africa and Brazil later. But you can see the places that it's easier to do business do grow better. And interestingly, Gujarat, where Modi came from before he became prime minister, he was the leader of Gujarat. They're some of the best business people in the world. And so you can click on this and learn about the people from Gujarat and learn about how they have businesses around the world, extraordinarily successful entrepreneurs. So is this 21st century going to be the one where India really cuts poverty dramatically and becomes as wealthy as China's managed to become? And of course, the hope is yes. What would hold that back? Well, one of the things that's held India back is that while it has gotten wealthier, it still has a large number of people who struggle to find employment, especially those who are higher educated. And that's partly a function of the fact that India's economy, while it's growing, hasn't produced tons and tons of jobs for people with higher levels of education. And you can see the top 10% of Indians their wealth has grown significantly. The bottom 50% has declined somewhat. It's that middle 40, that's the middle class of any country. And I think in many ways you have to give Vietnam and Japan earlier and China in the most recent period credit for lifting up the big, broad middle. And that's where India has not matched China, is having a big, growing, broad middle class that is benefiting from India's growing economy. And India has been decimated. Not by COVID per se in terms of people dying from COVID, but the disruption to India's economy from the pandemic has been horrific, absolutely horrific. India has one of the highest suicide rates in the world, really, really sobering. And then part of that is a function of how difficult life can be, how precarious it is, and the lack of access to psychiatrists, psychologists, and other mental health professionals, and somewhat to the stigma that people don't want to talk about mental illness. We've gone through that in the United States. India has some other challenges to its growing more economically and liberating more and more of its people from poverty. And that is something that we need to take more note of worldwide as a growing water crisis. South Africa, Cape Town is one of the cities that's very, very, very concerned about availability of drinking water in the future. You can see large portions of India have very high water availability risks. And some of the cities with the highest concerns about water availability are in India, Chennai and New Delhi. Some of the most polluted cities in the world are India and China. They're industrializing like the United States and Europe and other countries did, and they had terrible air quality until you get rich enough and then you green your economy over time. But China and India are in the process of doing the same economic growth as Europe, the United States, and Japan and Australia did, and they're also producing the same high levels of carbon emissions that we did. And it has serious consequences for health. And you can see this is a bigger version of the same map. It has enormous consequences. So here's Richmond and air quality versus New Delhi. And that amount of particulates in the air, you guys should click on this. It's just a fascinating display that it's not India compared to China. That you can do that too, but you can go inside these countries, like as you can come into the United States and Britain and France, huge disparities within countries. And wealthier people in India can live in much healthier settings with a lot less exposure to unhealthy air. And if you're poor in India, you don't have that privilege. You're much more susceptible to unhealthy air quality. India is making extraordinary strides on solar power. And that's an example where if you can learn from technology and policies in other parts of the world that have worked for them, and you can actually maybe sidestep some of the steps by jumping right straight to cleaner energy provision. And cost of power, I think India is the one place where solar power energy generation is cheaper than using fossil fuels, right? That's the goal that we're really trying to get to with green power. And we're getting there, is that eventually producing electricity with green power will be cheaper than with carbon, than with natural gas or coal or oil. And India is already there, so that's really encouraging. And then, as you all saw for the homework assignment, India's become a real mecca, not just for software development, although it is for that, but in medical advances and medical tourism. And you watched in that episode about frugal innovation, Dr. Devi Shetty, he's also profiled in a Netflix series called The Surgeon's Cut. I highly recommend that you watch that. But India can become, in a sense, a provider of medical services around the world, either by people going to India to get them or by Indian entrepreneurs taking their skills and opening clinics around the world in places where healthcare is really expensive. And Dr. Devi Shetty's done that in the Cayman Islands. And again, this is one of those examples where India can grow its economy by manufacturing, and that always is a way that most countries do, but they can do it in services, right? Technology services, biomedical services, medical services that have bigger margins. And so India has real potential to become an economic superpower. But as this class has shown, it has its challenges, as China had its challenges, as Vietnam has had its challenges, Hong Kong, Singapore, the United States, Denmark, and as we'll be moving on in future weeks to South Africa and Brazil. Every country has its own unique advantages and strengths and its own unique challenges that it has to come to grips with. So thank you very much, and I'll see you at the next class. We'll do women's rights, women's role in the economy, and we'll have a debate on commercial surrogacy.